Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to take a look at costs in the long run. It's going to involve a kind of crazy looking graph, but I think that you're going to be able to get it. Let's get started. Okay, so the first part up here is just kind of describing something that is really a phenomena about the production function. And we could have actually kind of done this when we talked about the production function back in 3.1, where we were relating inputs to outputs. And in the long run, we can kind of describe this notion of like if we were to change our inputs and change how many we have, sometimes that's going to actually result in a larger proportion of output. And what that essentially describes is that like we're scaling up the size of the operation, right? So the scale of production. And if we are scaling up the size of the operation and we're getting more output relative to the size of our input increase, we would call that increasing returns to scale. What that refers to is like, let's say you were to increase your inputs by 10% and you saw an increase in output of 20%. Right? That would be increasing returns to scale. Constant returns to scale would be like if I increased my inputs and I found that I got a proportional amount of output that would change. So I maybe doubled the amount of inputs and I doubled the amount of outputs. And then decreasing returns to scale would be actually if, let's say, I doubled my inputs, but I only got like 1.5 times my output. So it's really about kind of the relationship between how many inputs I'm adding in and what kind of output I'm seeing as a result of that. This is really describing the effect of scale on the productivity of the inputs, because sometimes you're going to have this scenario where you're increasing how many inputs you have and you're going to get way more output. That's because you're actually increasing the productivity of those inputs as you add a couple more. The workers are specializing, they're taking advantage of maybe that, like, you're going to do this job, you're going to do this job. And as the company maybe gets larger, you're able to kind of squeeze a little bit more efficiency out of everybody. But then your company starts to get larger and larger and it actually kind of flattens out in terms of how much that output is going to increase by. And then at a certain point, your company is going to keep getting bigger, but it's actually going to fall in terms of how productive the inputs are. And again, that's miscommunication issues. There's a bunch of different reasons why that kind of thing would happen. So this is really describing the relationship of inputs and outputs, increasing returns, constant returns, and decreasing returns. And returns here means the amount of output. Now, related to that, and it's not quite the same concept, is actually kind of describing costs in the long run. So this first part is about production in the long run, and these are the terms that we use to describe that. When we're talking about costs in the long run, it would refer to the idea that if we could change all of our inputs, so all of our inputs would be variable. Now, most companies could imagine, like, maybe let's say your company has one factory and 100 workers and 10 machines. Right? And so your company would have this short run average total cost curve. In other words, like in that snapshot moment, in that short run moment, your average total cost would look like that. It would have this U shape. And maybe you doubled the size of your company and you had 2 factories and 200 workers and 20 machines. So I literally doubled the size of my company. And then what I would find at short run average total cost curve 2 is that my minimum point of that cost curve is now lower than where the first one was, right? And so it's really actually happening where it's related to this notion of returns to scale, but it's not quite the same thing. It's actually saying that as my company is getting bigger, I'm seeing that my average cost per unit is going to fall. And then my company, let's say we tripled in size compared to that first option. Now at SRATC 3, so this is the third ATC curve, I have 3 factories and 300 workers and 30 machines. So I am literally 3 times as large as SRATC 1. And what I'd find there is that my minimum average cost is even lower than what it used to be. So every time I'm getting bigger here, I'm lowering my average costs. But at a certain point, maybe I'm 4 times as large as my SRATC 1. At this point, I notice that my costs start to go back up again, right? I've gotten so big with 400 workers and 4 factories, all spread across America, and 40 different machines, that it's harder for me to coordinate production. It's harder for me to coordinate marketing. It's harder for me to coordinate ordering my inputs. And so my average cost actually started to tick back upwards again. What we're going to do first is connect the point on each SRATC that minimizes ATC to create what we're going to call an LRATC, a long-run average cost curve. And it kind of looks like something like this, right? So it's kind of a wonky looking graph, but it looks a little bit like that. And it would keep going back up again, just like that. And that's our LRATC. LRATC. And what this represents is the lowest average cost for every possibility of the size of a company, right? So what's our minimum average cost for every single possible combination of the sizes of our companies? Because you can imagine, even though I said one factory and 100 workers and 10 machines, and two factories and 200 workers and 20 machines, and three factories and 300 workers, 30 machines, you can imagine little intervals in between all of those, where you might have SRATC 1.5, and that one might be like right about in here. And you might have another one that's SRATC 2.5, and that one might be right about here. And then you might have an SRATC that's even a little bit bigger. And I actually think I was misquoting the numbers on that one. So this one would be like SRATC 2.5, or no, this is 3.5, right? So that's 3.5. This is 2.5, and you can imagine that you would even have little intervals in between each of these. And again, what this LRATC represents is, in the long run, all of your inputs are variable. So what would be maybe the lowest average cost of production out of all the infinite combinations of your company's size? Well, that would be the minimum point on this LRATC. This describes the effect of scaling up the size of your company on your average cost of production. Now, what we find in every company is that they kind of have three ranges where this occurs. And what really occurs for most companies is that it comes down and it kind of flattens out, that LRATC, and it starts to come back up again, just like that, right? And so you'd have this kind of stage one, and we call this stage one economies of scale. Economies of scale. And that's this stage right here, where your LRATC is falling. So as we're moving from these first SRATC curves to the second SRATC curve, we are in what we call the economies of scale range, where LRATC is decreasing as output rises. And I gave you some kind of examples and explanations for why that happens, but it's fairly straightforward about thinking about why that would happen. Now, in this second stage, that LRATC, we have squeezed out all the efficiencies that we really can out of getting bigger. And so this second stage is called constant, right, returns to scale. Constant returns to scale. Then the third, and so it actually shares a name as up here. So because they're related concepts, related but not the same. This one, and this one is diseconomies of scale. This is where the last one is where you have higher and higher average long-run costs. And that's where we'd see that LRATC start to bend back upwards again. Now, companies typically don't want to be in that third stage, right? Huge conglomerates, like big companies that do a zillion different things, they sometimes end up in that stage, and they've just become so big that actually their average cost of producing units is higher than it otherwise would be. But most companies would probably want to operate in either stage one or stage two. Now, how would I know where my company should operate? Well, that's actually based on demand for your product, right? You could say that, well, if my demand only exists over here, and it stops because there's not that much demand for the product, then there's no reason for me to get this huge. Even though minimizing average cost would be really productively efficient, I'm not going to do that because I only have demand that's over here. So in the real world, it's a little bit more complicated as to what exactly the size, the optimal size of a company would be. Now, long and short of this whole second part where it talks about economies of scale, constant returns, and diseconomies, this is only referring to the LRATC. And then we have this thing, increasing returns, constant returns, decreasing returns to scale. This refers to the relationships between inputs and outputs. They're related concepts, but not quite the same. This one is really based on costs, economies of scale, diseconomies. It's kind of in the name, economies, costs. And these are about returns, which is about production. So hopefully this helps you understand a little bit more about costs in the long run. I'll see you next time.